radio. For some it's just noise, but for me it's a passion, which is why I wanted to look into pirate radio, to try and find out if there's a way of bringing the ethos back into commercial broadcasting, which is why I sat down with Brian Green of pirate.ie to find out about the spirit of pirate radio.
I've always been interested in radio, and that's a very standard answer, but I can track it back to being a child in my father's arms at about 1.5 years of age. Probably one of my earliest memories was being in his arm, and I have a twin brother, so my twin brother was in the other arm, and we were dancing around the kitchen. We weren't dancing on our feet, but we were dancing in our father's arms around the kitchen. It would be about 6 o'clock or 6:30 in the morning, and RTE Radio 1, we're talking 1971, 1972, would come on in the morning. It would start up, and when it would start up with its interval signal, which is O'Donnell O'Boo, do 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 do. But it would repeat the jingle because the transmitter was warming up to the sound of the interval signal. It wouldn't kind of come on and blow if you played Led Zeppelin when the transmitter wasn't quite warm. And we danced around the kitchen to that. I've loved radio going back to that era, but going back to when I was about 5 and 6 and I was breaking radios and putting them back together with my brother. And then at around 9 we were transmitting on walkie-talkies onto the FM band. Yeah, then we got into pirate radio around 1984, 1985. We were transmitting on shortwave and FM, and yeah, we've just been at it like for as long as I can remember.
So you technically started broadcasting then when you were about, what were you saying, 8, 9?
About 9 or 10, but like that would be like for 20 minutes, you know, or half an hour or something, as long as the batteries would last. But we were like, it was a proof of concept. It was an interest area. It wasn't insignificant that we were doing it, because it wasn't just playing on walkie-talkies. We had worked out that the walkie-talkies were on 49.86 megahertz AM. You know, they're very different to broadcast, but they're very similar to listen to. So when a walkie-talkie, you know, has its first harmonic just around 100 FM, and you play music through the microphone or you talk through the microphone, it comes out on the radio. And then if you put two walkie-talkies together, you double the power. And then you can go halfway down the road, and you go out and you test this, and you find out that you are going halfway down the road and then no further. So yeah, we started about then, and the interest has been around then and all the way through. Well, that's just what I did. There was me, the twin brother, and another guy we were in school with, Shane Sinnott, and you know, we were up doing the same thing in Shane's house, and we were trying to put 3 walkie-talkies together to get even more power. At that point, we named the radio station. We named it Big Beat Radio, and this was around 1982, possibly 81, 82. We got the name of a record label from an obscure record collector magazine that was in the attic of the house we were in, and we used Big Beat Radio. But what happened was we broadcast about 3 streets away, which was like, oh my God, this is tremendous. But that wasn't the thing that really shook our world. What shook our world was, in a great way, is the next morning, a guy in our class, his father worked for reception reports in RTE. He heard us. He told his son. He told us in school the next day. And rather than being going, oh my God, RTE engineers have heard us on the radio, we weren't scared at all. This was a badge of honour. We had established something. We had gone 3 streets away. This was like something for 12-year-olds to you know, do. But, you know, it was the same principle. 2 or 3 years later, we were going a couple of miles, and, you know, 5 years after that, we were on the Dublin Mountains broadcasting all over Dublin.
And was that with Big Beat, or was that with a separate pirate station?
So Big Beat would have become a proper radio station in 86 with its own FM transmitter, a studio and a full-time schedule. For the summer of 1986, we were 15 years of age and we were on summer holidays. And then Big Beat becomes Centre Radio 6 months later at Christmas 86. Centre runs all the way through till December 31st, 1988, when the big shutdowns of all the pirate radio stations happened, at which time we were 7 days a week and we were doing a good kind of 70 hours, 75 hours a week of broadcasting. Then we go off for about 6 months and we come back in the middle of 1989 as Radio Caroline Dublin, and that's the station that kind of over 11 years really gets itself together, and it moves its transmitters up the Dublin Mountains and can be heard all over Dublin and into parts of Louth as well.
And was there any connection with what was Radio Caroline?
No, absolutely none. It was, if you kind of track the Radio Caroline story, it was a period of time that they were probably at their weakest, but that didn't have a bearing on our decision to call ourselves that. There has been Radio Carolines in Dublin from the late 60s through to the early 2000s. It's like CB radio people calling themselves the Rubber Duck or something. It's not the coolest name to use, because you are taking on the name of the original in many respects, and so I don't even know how we came about putting that name on the station, but it has no connection to the original Radio Caroline, except I just kind of some context on it. They were at their lowest. I think they were not broadcasting at all for a great period of those 11 years, and they were only broadcasting on satellite and internet for another part of that 11 years, but they weren't on the high seas anymore, and they were getting themselves back into fitness for their next period of broadcasting, which is now has them fully licensed in the south of England and occasional broadcasts from the Isle of Man. So it would be, let's say that's around 81, 82. Dublin's radio scene is on fire at this stage. Nova has arrived. Sunshine has been in Dublin around a year, and they are young stations and they are growing fast, and they're the big guys. They're the guys who came from Radio Caroline. Chris Carey and Robbie Robinson worked on Caroline, and then they came to Dublin and set up these stations. But the incumbent stations, the stations that were already here, are the ones I was listening to. So I was listening to AM radio, and I was listening to indigenous pirate radio stations in Dublin. I was listening to Radio Dublin and variations of ARD a little bit later on as it spun out to Community Radio 257, and I'm not saying I didn't listen to Nova and Sunshine, but I certainly was most listening to Radio Dublin in that era.
Looking back, there was, I think it was Radio Dublin that had been raided and were able to get their transmitter and equipment back due to a loophole in either it was the Constitution or the old B&T.
Yes, so that happened to many a station, and many times stations would go to court, and it would be more to test the law than anything else. But there were loopholes, and one of the more famous ones was that if your transmitter had additional uses and you had other requirements for it, that you were able to make a case that this is not only a transmitter, but it's also something else, and can I have it back, please? And you would then get it back after a short period of time, and you would have your equipment again to use. Not all raids returned equipment, and some raids were nastier than others. If the raiding parties knew that you were going to get your equipment back in a couple of days or weeks, they would come in and they would be a little bit more violent with the equipment as they removed it, and it would be damaged or broken and irreplaceable. It could be. I haven't heard that version of it, but it doesn't sound unusual because he was an unusual guy. I think he was very special in the history of Irish broadcasting. Well, we all know he is, but he just hasn't been recognised so in any kind of awards posthumously given to him.
True or false? Now, this is what's, kind of been whispered, if you like, but raids properly began because of what was then the old Radio 2. Seemed to be getting a little bit of with what pirate radio was doing, and kind of how much listenership pirate radio was getting. Oh yeah, well there'll be no secret about it, but I think it would be fair to put raids in context. There's been raids from the early 1970s all the way through the 70s, with through the era of the very large AM pirates, the indigenous stations that were broadcasting Big D and Radio Dublin and ARD, and those stations would have, and smaller stations would have been raided all the time. Or if they weren't being raided, there was threats of raids, and there was close downs to avert getting your equipment taken. But then into the early 80s, and those raids on the Super Pirates on Sunshine first, and then on the next day on Nova, they were coordinated, orchestrated, and were, targeted at particular stations who had grown very fast, were taking money out of RTÉ's pocket by big brand advertising.
They were taking agency adverts. They were taking major banks and consumer goods were advertising on these pirate stations. RTE was not one source of income. It didn't just have the licence fee. It also had advertising. It needed advertising. They knew better than most how much they were losing to these new guys. And they would have probably reported this through, and then, the raids happened. Then the raids were successful in that they took them off the air for a couple of hours. Then the stations came back and orchestrated their own formal close down, and it's really useful when there are disasters, but when those disasters are actually within the station itself, then radio really doubly comes into its own because it knows its own story. So when a station gets the opportunity to dramatise its own shutdown in its own time and say, this isn't fair, they're taking us off the air, and then they come back on, days later and say, we're back, hello, what was that all about? Aren't we really popular with the people who came out in the streets and supported us? So I'm not criticising what they do, but I'm just saying that given the opportunity, experienced radio stations will tell its own story very well.
Do you think something like that may have been a little bit hypocritical, considering the fact that, to certain stations there was these state letters sent, but yet you've certain politicians trying to canvass on stations?
There was a lot of hypocriticism. There was a lot of double standards, and it was on both sides. So there was this toing and froing as to, are these guys official? Can we go there and talk to them? But all the kids are listening to them. All the voters, the young voters, are listening to these stations. Can we go up and talk on their lunchtime news programme, on their tea time news programme? And renegades within parties and policies would change over time. Maybe more people from the political parties would go and talk on the Pirates. When I was about 12 years of age, that would have been 1982. Around this time of year, February 1982, there would have been a lot of adverts ran in the newspapers by the pirate radio stations wooing the politicians. This is really bizarre if you think about it. And the advertisements would be Fianna Fáil, love our listeners, make pirate radio legal, give Sunshine Radio a licence. Now, I'm using all the wrong words in terms of what they put in that ad, but that was what the sentiment of the ad was politicians, listen to our lobbying. We want you to licence us because we've got the listeners and they're your voters. And there was a lot of that going on. I'm not saying that's, good, bad or indifferent. I'm just saying that it's significant. And
I think maybe they should have been given the licence just because of what they've done and because of their determination, and just been maybe taxed annually, if you like, on their income, if that makes sense.
Well, regulation normally comes around the way that it came around in Ireland, so there will be a competition. If you have a licence for, Kildare or Wicklow or Dublin, you put it up and as a notice and say, anybody wants this, apply for it. Here are the rules. This is what you have to apply, comply with. And then the best person should win, know. And so should the Pirates have got the licenses?
Just looking through, what with the rules and the licenses that came into play, what would you add to it? Like if you were to bring in regulation, what would you have liked to have seen?
I would have liked to have seen that a couple of things. One of them was actually something that Minister Raper was talking about at the time, and I sat in public meetings up in DCU, or was it NIHE at the time, and heard him utter these things. He was much more interested in there being commercial radio and neighbourhood radio. They're his words, neighbourhood radio, not community radio, but neighbourhood radio. There was sight worldwide of this new term of low power FM, low power AM radio was a possibility. What happened was they licensed the commercial stations and waited about another 6 to 8 years to license any community stations. Now, there was a pilot community station licensed because they weren't prepared to license any, but there was a lot of pressure to put on a community radio station. Not a neighbourhood station, a community station. So what did they do? They said to the community radio stations, you all get together and we'll put on one station for the whole of Dublin and we'll call it, or they didn't decide what it was called, but they that's what they did. They put a licence out for one station. They'll call it special interest licence, and it was community radio stations were to come together and be happy with that. And some stations did. I think 9711 Radio in Glasnevin area and others did come together, and they called it Anna Livia, and it's been on the air ever since. It's changed its name to Dublin City FM. But what I was going to say is, so they licensed that, and at the same time there was a bit of pressure from the Irish Language Lobby, and they licensed another special interest licensed station, and that was Radio na Lifa. Now, within the last 18 months, and that's, you know, a good 25 years later, they have... it's more than 25 years, actually, isn't it? Well, it's about 25. They have encouraged Radio na Lifa and Dublin City FM to change their licence status from special interest to community. So they're now both community radio stations. But if you've asked me what would I have done differently, well, I'd have brought in neighbourhood radio, as Ray Burke was talking about, and I would have brought in lots of it. So something that would broadcast about half the radius of a community radio station that we have in Ireland, and it would broadcast maybe 3 to 5 miles, and there would be many more of them, and I would have brought them on stream immediately. Now, seeing as they were focused on commercial radio, maybe immediately would have been within the first 2 years.